would like to recognize the members of the Executive Council who are seated to my right, the President, and of course past President Senator Godwin Holtz. Welcome. I now invite to the podium our President, Mrs. Kay Menzies, for the welcome address.
Good evening, Reverend Dr. Ghany, Ms. Jane, and fellow chamber members, including our esteemed Senator. Welcome to what I know will be an interesting discussion. We've had a lot of conversation about the 9th Amendment over the last couple of months. The 20th of October, I think, is the 90th day, so we're almost at the end of it. And for us, the good news for the Chamber is we have a memorandum of understanding with the University of the West Indies. And as we went along with our discussions, we issued a press release that everybody's familiar with. We've had our own in-house discussions on the matter. The president of the bar came to make a presentation. And as we went along and listened to the quality or lack of quality of some of the discussions that were occurring, and saw the ads on both sides and everything, all the publicity that was occurring around the topic, it occurred to us to tap into that memorandum of understanding to help to educate our members further on the topic. And rather than to tell us or tell you guys, or including myself, what to think, to give us the wherewithal to think for ourselves. For a lot of us, the Constitution is newer to us than it should be. It's something that it's always been there, but it's never been something we needed to look at in order to do business. And so it's a new topic for many people. And that's a good thing. Hopefully it's not going to be a dead topic after this. The 9th Amendment itself, however, there's a lot of pros and cons that were thrown around, a lot of recitations that have been thrown out. And as I say, the quality of the debate has declined over time. So we went to the UWI and we asked them to give us one of their experts and let him come and let him discuss the matter with us. And rather than have somebody tell us what to think, to give us the tools to think for ourselves and analyze for ourselves the wherewithals of the 9th Amendment, what it does in regard to us, how it affects us, and where we go with it. Having said that, I'm not going to waste your time listening to me. I'm going to ask you to spend your time much more valuably listening to Dr. Ghany. So enjoy the upcoming discussion. I know I will. Thanks.
Dr. Ghany is the Dean of the Faculty of Social Services at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. He is also a senior lecturer in government whose areas of teaching, research, and publication lie in the fields of parliamentary studies and constitutional affairs. He is the coordinator of the Constitutional Affairs and Parliamentary Studies Unit, CAPSU, at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. Dr. Ghany is a well-known commentator and analyst of political and contemporary issues in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. Dr. Ghany holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Ghany.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for your kind introduction. Madam President of the Chamber, my colleague, Mrs. Bennett, the head of the UWI Open Campus in Belize, distinguished members of the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry, other distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure for me to have been invited to Belize to participate in a round of discussions on the issue of the 9th Amendment that has been laid before your Parliament. And I want to say how much I appreciate the work, the joint efforts of both the BCCI and the UWI in respect of the Memorandum of Understanding that has been signed in furtherance of promoting public education. And I want to thank the BCCI and the UWI for collaborating on making it possible for me to come to Belize to participate in the events that I have participated in between yesterday and today. And I really do appreciate it, and I want to say thank you for the arrangements that have been made for me to be here. The UWI has been involved in public education for more than 60 years. This is something that happens throughout the region, and the lectures that have taken place yesterday and are going to take place now are part of that tradition, and therefore the tradition of public education on many issues continues. In addressing the issue of the 9th Amendment to the Constitution of Belize, I must say that when I first saw it, there were obvious issues that arose in my mind about the constitutional dimensions of the ouster of the jurisdiction of the courts in relation to the Section 2 and Section 69 being read together. And I had called into some programs here in the media to be able to talk about it. And at that time, the proposed revisions were not on the table. I have since seen that there are revisions, and I note that certain aspects of the 9th Amendment are intended to be changed. And I rather suspect that when the appropriate stage in the House of Representatives comes, that those amendments are likely to be made. That perhaps is in response to the reaction of civil society, who clearly have taken a very active role in making statements on the matter. The BCCI issued a statement, which I had seen, the Bar Association, the Council of Churches. There have been public consultations where views have been expressed on all sides. And I think that that is the mark of a functioning democracy, whereby the public reaction is one that can in fact produce a response from a government that appears to be prepared to take out things that many persons in the public domain appear to be uncomfortable with. But there is an aspect of the 9th Amendment that perhaps I've floated a couple of times, but I haven't sensed that there is much reaction on the issue of what was initially an anti-privatization clause in the context of all of the proposed Section 143, and what I would now term as a nationalization clause, because I note that Section 143D is likely to come out, and the D was the part that dealt with the issue of the future and any other entities being designated as public utilities by the National Assembly. And I note that that is now likely to go, which would suggest to me that what remains, the rump of what remains, is the water company, the electricity company, and the telecommunications. And that therefore the 9th Amendment will revolve around those in respect of the companies that are now the focus of what remains, or what would remain, of the 9th Amendment. So that the question of nationalization as opposed to anti-privatization suggests to me that a constitutional amendment is going to be used to protect the nationalization of three entities as public utilities. And the non-constitutional aspect of this, and that's the part I want to raise, has to do with the use of taxpayer dollars or public money to support those entities, and the fact that there is going to be a long-term commitment of public funds to sustain the operations of these entities. And from a business point of view, the issue of monopolies in business, and those of you in the business community would know that monopolies in business are perhaps not always the healthiest way or environment in which a business can operate, because the consumer may not necessarily get the best that can be offered, as opposed to the power of the marketplace when there is competition, and the extent to which the consumer can benefit from competition. So that dealing with a state monopoly or a state entity that will have constitutional protection to be able to function, I think creates a demand for there to be enhanced scrutiny on the question of performance. on the question of service and the way in which these companies are going to be run. Because one certainly does not want a situation to arise where you would have the companies being run on the basis that they rack up annual deficits that have to be funded from the public purse. And with a constitutional amendment in place to protect this, one has to ensure that the public will get value for money and they will get service commensurate with the fact that the taxpayers' money is going to be used to sustain these entities. And that is a matter that I think, I haven't seen too much discussion on it. And it is something that I think, in looking to the future, these are the kinds of demands that I rather suspect that civil society and more so the BCCI may want to consider in terms of how they advance a cause to ensure that there is the protection of the public interest in the way in which public money is going to be spent to be able to ensure that these entities continue to operate in a manner that would allow the public to be the prime beneficiaries of good service and good managerial performance. There is also the reality that as you go forward in time, these entities as public utilities will obviously be prime zones of political patronage should there be changes of government in years to come. And with the state control comes the ability to be able to dispense patronage, which is part of the political process. There's nothing wrong with it. It's the spoils system. It's how politics operates. But I think that in terms of how the public wants their money to be spent, they would need to have certain assurances that these entities are going to be managed in an efficient and effective manner that will not lead to the wastage of public money to prop up inefficient and ineffective enterprises now that there is going to be a constitutional amendment to protect them. And the issue of patronage and a change of government in future years, Belize is a functioning democracy. It has had changes of government, more than 2 changes of government. And in political science terms, there is a yardstick known as the 2-turnover rule that is used in developing countries. It was devised by the political scientist Samuel Huntington, that any country that has more than 2 changes of government, change one way, change back the other way, minimum 2 changes of government, is regarded as a functioning democracy. And as you look to the future, in years to come, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years, you're going to have situations where you may have changes of government back and forth. And that is a reality that needs to be looked at in the context of both patronage and performance, because it is important to ensure that the patronage that will be dispensed in the future will give the public the kind of performance that they would expect from all of this. Of course, where this is going to take the debate is that there will have to be an enhanced level of scrutiny of public expenditure on these entities to ensure that they function in a manner that is going to be desirable in the eyes of the public. In many other countries, you have parliamentary committees that are established in such a manner that they can scrutinize effectively the workings of public enterprises. I know in Trinidad and Tobago, in our constitution, about 10 years ago, the Trinidad and Tobago Parliament got a number of these special type joint select committees that are used to scrutinize public agencies, so that what you have is a mixture of government and opposition members in the House of Representatives sitting together with government opposition and independent senators in our Senate to create an entity that would have a mix of both government and opposition, with the independent senators holding the balance between them in terms of the chairmanship and the membership of these committees. So that what you get really in terms of that kind of parliamentary reform is adequate scrutiny of the functioning of a number of agencies. So you're calling in CEOs and chairmen of boards, etc., and other senior officials to come and sit before a parliamentary committee that's convened for the purpose of trying to engage in questioning of public officials to account for their stewardship, not on an ex post facto basis, but on a current account basis. You don't want, this is not like a public accounts committee that's going to get accounts that are 5, 10, or 15 years old and stale dated. We're talking about being questioned on current account and being able to explain to parliamentarians who have the right to question, and Parliament does have the right of oversight over the expenditure of public money, that it can exercise that role and be able to engage in that, because the public needs to be reassured that something will be done to make sure that the fact that these entities will be obviously in the public domain, that taxpayer dollars will be spent wisely. And one of the ways that this has been done in other parts of the Commonwealth Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago being used as an example, is the issue of parliamentary scrutiny and oversight. So that that, I think, enhances the entire process, brings value, it adds value to the process, and it certainly gives the public some measure of comfort that taxpayer dollars will be well spent. Of course, the issue of state control of the economy versus the free market, that ongoing tension between these two, raises the issue of the public sector and the private sector having some kind of entente as regards development. And there is a role for the public sector and the private sector to perhaps collaborate on development, because it is an important role to be played in the society. Thank you. It is an important role to be played in the society, insofar as being able to ensure that you can get that kind of collaboration so that the business community can play a role in development alongside the state, and that kind of partnership can perhaps maximize the way in which development can go forward. So it is something that has to be looked at. I don't sense that there is any particular concern on a widespread basis with the philosophy of the nationalization clause in the 9th Amendment. It's not something that I noticed that people have made much about. But I think that in terms of public education and raising issues that ought to be considered speaking to the future, we certainly want to ensure that as part of public education, that the issues are laid out, that these are things that are likely to arise in the future. Because these are public policy and public administration issues. These are not constitutional issues. So what I'm dealing with here is the public administration, public policy dimension of the 9th Amendment, which is really designed to address a nationalization issue that the state has expressed a particular desire to nationalize certain entities, and that in so doing, it is going to provide the protection of a constitutional amendment to guarantee them, so that a future government 20, 30, 40 years from now, who may want to make a change to that, will have to go and engage in a constitutional amendment to change that. The only other thing, and I've raised it publicly before, has to do with the shareholding between 50.1 and 50.9%. And the extent to which that is an issue in the public domain. But I merely mention it because it is part of what is out there in terms of the fact that 51% is deemed to be the majority shareholding as far as the 9th Amendment is concerned. So that from that point of view, I think that in speaking to an audience like members of the Chamber of Commerce, I would think that this is an issue that obviously would be of concern to members of the Chamber in respect of the business practices that will emanate from entities that will have that kind of constitutional protection and enjoy that kind of nationalized status, and at the same time whether someone is going to advocate for good service, good performance, good management, proper oversight of the accounts, and to ensure the best possible practices, and that should there be changes of government in years and years and years to come, that what will happen is that the political patronage that may be dispensed will be dispensed in a manner that would allow good management practices to prevail and effective managers to be appointed, because that is going to be an essential component in ensuring that the companies will function in a manner that will ensure that the public gets value for money. So for me, in looking at this now in terms of the non-constitutional aspects of it, part of my own, apart from being Dean of Social Sciences, before I got into university administration, I used to teach public administration, and I have an interest in the way in which the public administration aspects of public companies and state enterprises operate, together with my own teaching in administrative law for social scientists, and the question of parliamentary oversight of public institutions. These are important things, and I think that it would help to provide the supporting cast for what is going to go forward as a new dispensation in terms of having nationalized industries that enjoy constitutional protection. I think that these are things that will add value to the discussion. I don't propose to lecture for very long, and I'm going to come to an end shortly, but I do hope that in the discussion that is going to emerge from what I'm talking about, that I can develop further on some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Take them from here. It would invite the entire panel to respond.
Okay. All right.
In the event.
Yeah, sure.
Besides, you don't need to stand for all that one. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghany. We now invite your comments and questions for the entire panel, but I'm sure you have lots of questions for Dr. Ghany. Senator.
Thank you, Dr. Ghany. Do you think, given the speed at which telecommunication systems are evolving today, that it is a useful undertaking for government to want to assume control of telecoms?
Well, that is a matter of public choice. I mean, governments wanting to assume control of it is. That is a matter of what is going on. I mean, it is something that in the wider developed world, the issue of private involvement or private investment in such entities is such that it's a kind of market that has lots of competition. But in the context of the Commonwealth Caribbean, you certainly have the state being involved in public company. I mean, in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the telecom, one of the telecom providers is state-owned. I mean, B-Mobile, it's Lime or whatever it's called in the rest of the Commonwealth Caribbean. But you also have Digicel, which is a private entity. And the government of Trinidad and Tobago is now saying that it's prepared to allow a third provider into the marketplace. So the state has a telecommunications company, but the state has allowed other providers to come into the marketplace. So I don't think that there's anything wrong with the state being involved in the telecoms business. I think the issue of whether you will allow others to come in the marketplace is really where the matter will go, because I think the state has to determine what is more important, customer satisfaction on a wider scale, or customer problems and dissatisfaction, which obviously can be a political double-edged sword as well. It's not exactly the best thing to have a single provider for which the state is responsible and you have unhappy customers. That's not good for business. And if the state companies get some kind of competition from another provider, which creates a playing field in which the state can be a competitor. I mean, you just change the rules of the game on the playing field. If you have something like that, and I'm using the Trinidad and Tobago model, that's one way where the state is involved. And another way is if you want to have a state monopoly. Because in Trinidad and Tobago, we used to have that too, where it was a state monopoly of telecommunications, and the rates were high, and a lot of things were quite high, and the minute that Digicel was allowed into the marketplace, all of a sudden the rates dropped, and so on. That's the effect of competition. We're seeing it also in terms of the airline industry in the Eastern Caribbean with, Caribbean Airlines has now taken over or has control of Air Jamaica, so that there is a merger between the two, but there is the issue of RedJet. And RedJet coming in, and with RedJet coming into the marketplace, the airfares have all gone down to go to Barbados, to go to Jamaica, to go to Guyana. So, I mean, it's a reality of business. I mean, you can't escape it. Competition does ensure that you have, that the cost is a little less, and you have to provide better service to be able to permit some kind of environment that is going to be favorable. Because at the end of the day, people want to get good service if they're paying money, and I think that's an important aspect. So, I don't have a problem if the state wants to be involved. Personally speaking, I don't have a problem if the state wants to be involved in it. But one has to look at, the kind of environment that is created. That's a different story altogether.
Thank you.
Anisha.
Good evening, Dr. Ghany, and thank you for that presentation. I'd like to ask with what you've mentioned just now, is within the Constitution in your country, is it etched in there that telecoms would be an essential service controlled by the government, or something similar to what is being proposed here for Belize? And secondly, what is your take on the whole concept of having the utilities in a constitution such as this? Is it unusual in the Commonwealth Caribbean or even the Commonwealth countries?
Well, the issue of essential services in Trinidad and Tobago is covered in the Industrial Relations Act that makes provision for certain essential services to be defined, and that has implications for who can strike and who can't strike and what have you. So that public utilities are listed as essential services in that. But for example, the Postal Service is regarded as a public utility, but it was privatized in Trinidad and Tobago about 10 years ago. New Zealand Post came and was offered by the then government that was in power at the time to come in and privatize the Postal Service. So New Zealand Post came in and changed. So you now have TT Post, which is a privatized company. So you have that. So that it is not unusual to have public utilities or other entities classified as essential services. You may not find it in the Constitution, but our Constitution in Trinidad and Tobago makes reference to certain parliamentary committees that have responsibility over the things. So we have a Public Accounts Committee, but we also have a Public Accounts Enterprises Committee, which deals only with the state enterprises, and those are the entities that will have a majority control of public money in them, and the Parliament therefore asserts the right to have these entities scrutinized. The key to it is how they're scrutinized, what's the composition of these committees, because you don't want these committees to be rubber stamping committees. You want them to be committees that exercise real control in terms of the scrutiny process. And certainly in 2001, some new committees were established in Trinidad and Tobago that now deal with a wide range of public agencies where public money is involved. So that I think that, the issue of the state being involved in trying to control certain aspects of utilities or other public services or whatever, that is a part of an old tradition that exists. That has come up against a paradigm shift that emerged in the 1970s and 80s of the international lending agencies having to bail out many developing countries that had run deficit budgets and had got themselves into financial difficulty. And part of the structural adjustment package was the privatization deal. And many countries started to go in the direction of privatization as a means of trying to address some of the problems that they faced in exchange for receiving the foreign aid to bail them out of their difficulties. What has happened in some countries in the post-structural adjustment period is that the privatization agenda has remained, and the economy has been structurally adjusted to permit a greater private sector involvement. But the state has got to have the money to engage in the agenda. The state can't engage in an agenda of control if it doesn't have the money to do so. Now in Trinidad and Tobago, in the period after 1992, and certainly down to about 2002, that 10-year period is one in which the post-structural adjustment era, after we went through our difficulties of the late 80s, created an environment in which there was more tolerance of private capital coming into the marketplace to invest in public companies. What happened in the last decade was that there was a gas boom in Trinidad and Tobago, and the state now had
greater fortune in its hands, and as a consequence of that started to want to assert its muscle once more to be able to reinvest and take over companies. So that I think that in order to sustain an agenda like that, you need to have the money. So now this new government that has come in and is facing all of these financial difficulties is now looking to get out of this kind of dominance in the state sector. So that I think the critical thing will be, apart from the desire to control, is the money to be able to do so, because you could end up in a situation where you have the control and you don't have the money to do it. So how do you get out of it? And I think that is to my mind where the greater concern would have to go, because the use of public money really to prop some of these things up. You know, you can't run a $5 million deficit and think that the Treasury is going to be the bailout guy who's just going to show up and say $5,000 to balance the books and that's the end of that. That's not good for business. It's not good business either. And I think that a number of state enterprises have now got to become not only socially responsible, but they have to become fiscally responsible as well. And it's in that area of fiscal responsibility that the political desire to control must be matched by an ability to manage. And that is really the issue.
One other concern that I just wanted to get a better understanding is this practiced anywhere in the Commonwealth countries where you see utilities within a constitution?
I haven't come across this specific concept of utilities being put into the Constitution, but I have come across references to, which is broader than that, broader than just utilities, references to enterprises in which the state has majority control. I have come across that. I know in Trinidad and Tobago it's stated in that way. The question is whether the state wants to have or to divest itself of that, because that then becomes the will of the state is then expressed in how they want to handle it. The constitutional protection is to say that you are a nationalized industry, and if that is what the political will at the time is, and that is how the political will is expressed, and that is what the society at the time may want and so on, that's fine. I think the key issue is, one, what's the escape clause? How do you get out of it if it's no longer working? And two, if it is going to remain, what provisions are you going to make to ensure that there is efficiency and effectiveness in the management and the provision of service to the public? Because provision of service to the public then becomes the responsibility of the state if the state takes over the enterprise. And therefore, I think that is where the debate for me would have to go in answer to the question you're asking.
Other questions, please?
Yes, good night. I can see the argument from the government side in saying that foreign reserve can be an issue with having so many foreign companies in the country. But what I'm hearing from what you just said is, if we put in place a regulatory body to oversee these companies, then that makes the effort or this situation better. Is that what you're suggesting? Have an independent parliamentary body looking after these companies?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that if you are going to provide a constitutional protection, and in Trinidad and Tobago this was a debate about 10 or 11 years ago, the question of having these special joint select committees that are charged with a specific responsibility of looking at the overall functioning of these agencies, not just like a public accounts committee which is just going to go through the balance books and say, okay, fine, you balance it and then that's it. We're talking about quality for money, value for money. It's more than just asking questions about money, it's about asking questions about the whole performance of the thing. And I think that once the state gets into the business of giving this kind of constitutional protection, then there may be other responsibilities that the state may wish to discharge if it thinks that that is wise to do, and that is to be able to make public provision for scrutiny and oversight. Mm-hmm. Because if you're talking about public money, then you need to ensure that public money is going to have questions being asked by the representatives of the people. And your parliament is one that, like the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, has government and opposition in the lower house as elected, and in the upper house, government and opposition, and you have a sort of crossbench independent element that is not, on neither one side or the other. And in our parliament, that is used as the basis on which to find the chairs of some of these joint select committees. So you have a wider membership, and you have it functioning on the basis that the chair of the committee is not from one side or the other, but the chair is drawn from that third sector that can therefore play that role of carrying out that scrutiny function. Because you want to make sure that public money is adequately accounted for, and you want to make sure that public management is carried out. Because what's going to be the big issue here will be public management. This is really a public management issue. I mean, people want to know that their water services or the electricity services or the telecommunication services are going to be handled in a manner that gives you good service, good performance, and you feel good about the service that you're getting, because you are going to pay a monthly bill or quarterly bills or whatever, however you're billed. You do have a bill to pay, and you're paying that bill to the government, essentially, so that you would like to see also that provision is made for that. And in terms of public administration and public policy, these are issues that you would normally find arising when the state moves in to be able to take control of a sector.
Now this is proposed by whom really? Is it should be coming from which sector really? The chamber, okay?
Sorry, all of us.
Okay. And also apart from this, I know this is a grave concern. But what other concerns should the normal Belizean should have in terms of this amendment you hear out there? This is going to lead us into dictatorship, and how really is it? What's the other concerns about this?
Well, I'm not seeing a dictatorship issue arising here. I'm not seeing that, and I think that when you talk about constitutional amendments, one has to think of constitutional amendments in the long term, because the constitution is not easily amended. So you could have at a future time changes of government back and forth, as the case may be. So in thinking about a constitutional amendment, you have to think about how the other side would manage exactly the same thing that is going to be there. And then it may come back again. And so if you get these changes of government, because the premise of a democratic constitution is that provision is always made that you can have changes of government as you go along, because that is what is the hallmark of your democracy, the ability to have changes of power back and forth. I mean, Belize, you've had changes of power back and forth. So you are a functioning democracy. The question is, how does one view this in the context of another political party operating exactly the same provisions? How is that to be viewed? And then at a future time, a change back and a back and forth. And that's the way in which it ought to be viewed, because you've got to take the long view on this. There's another way to look at it too. You can take the political parties off the table. Let's take the political parties out of the agenda completely. Take them off the table. All of them. Just look at the provisions on their own in terms of public utilities, in terms of the Section 69, the Section 2 or whatever, and look at it from a public interest standpoint, and just in terms of institutions, and say, okay, this is what we have. How do we want this to run? How do we want this to be operated? There is a constitutional protection for public utilities. They are going to be protected. The state has a commitment, therefore, to prop these up. There's very little wiggle room for the state to come out of the arrangement. However, there could be a way out, but the thing is that it's a nationalization clause, so that certain other arrangements would have to be made, if that were the case. How do we make sure that going into this venture is going to be done on the basis that you're going to get the best possible deal out of this? Now, this has nothing to do with the Constitution. This has to do with performance management and the way public money is going to be spent. And I think that if we go into that zone where you remove political parties from the process and just look at it as strict business practices, strict management practices, what would you want if you had to run a business like that? What would be the things you would need to do to make sure the public got top quality service? One, you're a monopoly. Two, you may not have the best possible scrutiny available to you, but we don't mind having scrutiny, because that's most probably where the equivalent or the semi-equivalent of a competitor will come from. Somebody to ask hard questions to you. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why did you do that? What was the policy behind that? What was the thinking behind this policy decision? What was the business decision you made here? Was that the best business decision you could have made? I mean, there are a whole host of questions. But if you're running a business with a monopoly, sure, there are benefits. I mean, in the private sector, you get a monopoly to run. That's great. I mean, you have a monopoly. But at the same time, you have a social responsibility to provide a good service. So you're not being prompted by the marketplace, which is the natural prompter of better service and so on, where you get competition. That's what your competition is doing. Well, you need to match it. Okay, that's a natural, that's the sort of invisible hand that runs a lot of businesses and the free marketplace. We're not talking about a free marketplace here. We're talking about essentially a business monopoly. So the only thing that's going to drive you to provide good service is social responsibility. That you have it in your heart that you want to provide that. How do we make sure that you keep that social responsibility intact? You've got to have adequate scrutiny. You've got to have adequate questioning. You've got to have some measure of accountability. That is not going to be a sham accountability, but real accountability. That people can feel comfortable about. If it is that the political patronage that is dispensed to put managers in place and a board in place and all of that, that you're not engaging in trying to cover up errors and mistakes, but that if it's not working, you make changes to managers. You send us clear message that you're not prepared to tolerate non-performance or underperformance. And I think that will reinforce in the mind of the public that the state is really serious about making sure that these constitutionally protected entities are going to be properly run. Because that is a non-constitutional issue. That's public administration and public policy and public management. It has nothing to do with the Constitution.
Actually, Doctor, I have a question. Now, the concept of parliamentary committees, that's quite fine from the perspective of Trinidad, where we're 4 times smaller than Belize, and we have 1 million and change, and we have a significant population of educated people and professionals, and we do have non-partisan people. Now, in a place like Belize, where there's a significant geographical territory with the population basically of Barbados, there's a significant partisan element to just about the entire population, or just about the entire working or effective or professional population. So my question is, what does one do to the concept? How does that apply to the concept of the parliamentary committee? I understand if it exists in smaller territories, smaller island territories in the Caribbean, that may be applied or applicable to Belize. But then you get to the concept of the shared geographical territory, and that would affect the performance aspect as well as the partisanship.
Well, partisanship and performance, are things that operate in a particular kind of way. And partisanship can go to the point where you try to hide underperformance. And also partisanship can go to the point of saying, this is not working and you're making us look bad. So we need to make changes here because, we can't go on. I mean, I'm talking about a line minister now, talking to a board of directors and saying, what are you fellas doing? What's going on here? I'm getting licks out of the public because of the way you're running this company. Now, partisanship can work in a way whereby you can shake things up because you have to make sure that you're getting performance. And it could be a wide geographic expanse, it could be a small population, it could be whatever it is. There is a certain public management performance issue that arises. But, ministers in all over the Commonwealth Caribbean in any form of fashion, a line minister who has an underperforming board of directors and a CEO of a state company is not going to be a happy camper to be able to be taking that kind of public criticism for which the line minister has to take responsibility, and the board is just not cutting it. Because the board has to be able to step up and deliver. Because, at some point the issue is going to be how is public money being managed? And if you're the line minister and your board and the CEO is letting you down, then that creates an incentive enough for partisanship to kick in and say, okay guys, I appreciate that you're loyal to the party and you're good party supporters, but this is not working here. We need to change the team. And within every political party, there is talent available. There is fresh talent, and sometimes in political parties, the ability to have internal criticism is worse than the criticism across the aisle. And sometimes the internal politics is perhaps more vicious than the politics across the aisle. So that there's no shortage of replacements. I mean, you have no shortage of replacements of people who can come forward. And I think that in terms of discussion and in terms of advancing the discussion, I think from a public education standpoint, the whole question of performance with these entities is, to my mind, where the discussion is going to have to go after the amendment is passed and so on. I'm not sensing that there's any public opposition to it, and I sense that that is really not the issue. The issue with the 9th Amendment has been the ouster of the jurisdiction of the courts and the Section 2 and the Section 69 in tandem with one another. I'm not sensing that Section 143 and 145, well, maybe a part of 145, but 143 really wasn't the big issue. I know that the subsection D is likely to go, then there's less angst about somebody else being singled out to become a public utility. So we've moved from an anti-privatization clause to just a nationalization issue in terms of 3 particular entities. But the public will want to know that their business is being managed, that their taxpayer dollars are being properly managed. And I think that to my mind, is where ministerial concern should really go, regardless of which minister it is in which government as we go to the future, because this has to be looked at in the future. This can't be looked at only in terms of today.
Senator Rose.
A follow-up question, Dr. Ghany. I'm very clear on your explanation with respect to public administration of these utilities, but I can tell you that here in Belize, after 30 years of independence, the Public Accounts Committee does not work. It does not work, not through 6 governments. The Senate is evolving down rather than up. And even though recently, in 2008, amendments were passed to give the Senate greater oversight, which was stimulus from the chamber. It cannot function because the composition of the Senate, the government side controls, and they have no interest in looking at the quotas. I say that without apology. The introduction in the 7th Amendment, the 6th Amendment of another senator representing the NGO community, which would have given an off balance from the government and perhaps would have allowed the Senate then to utilize these oversight powers. The senator has not been, the instrument to appoint the senator has not been signed, and the Prime Minister has clearly said it will not happen anytime soon. So we're still in a position where the government controls. So public expectation of scrutiny at the highest level of these utilities would be wishful thinking at this stage, I dare say, perhaps another government. However, I think what the public is concerned about is the need to have, in the first place, enshrine these utilities in the Constitution. Let's take water. Government has owned it now for 4 years. Nobody is complaining about that. Nobody even mentioned that. The very telecom company, government has controlled it now going on 2 years. And electricity, about 4 months, 3 to 4 months. And so I think the question is, people are asking is, why the Constitution? Because quite frankly, even this move is not intended to give it the ultimate constitutional protection. In ordinary law, there could be a repeal in one day with 16 members of Parliament, 16 members of the House, and of course, simple majority of the Senate. This amendment is not being enshrined in what the Constitution calls Schedule 2, which would give it the protection of 3/4 of the member and a 90-day waiting period. It is being enshrined in the section that gives it only, that requires only 2/3 of the members to amend, which is 21, and it has no 90-day protection, so it could be done in day 1. So all we've done is move it from 16 to 21 members, and that is all the protection we're affording all this hullabaloo. And quite frankly, I think many people recognize that the only reason this is happening is to do two things. First, it is to give it extrajudicial litigation protection. That is the fundamental, to prevent the continuing litigation for both utilities, the electricity, well, telecoms and subsequent electricity. One. And the second is, of course, political, because it gives a significant national boost to feel that we now own these. I can assure you, there's been absolutely no thought, no discussion whatsoever as to the economics, the administration, the long-term benefit, the pros and cons of everything you've said. I don't think has ever been considered by any of the powers that intend to make this. It is strictly a case of, if it's enshrined in the Constitution, when it hits the court cannot now say that it is not for a proper public purpose, because it is in the Constitution and the will of the people now say we must have majority. So the courts will not be able to rule on that issue, and will then only be able to rule on the issue of compensation. That's fundamental reason. And the second reason, it gives a tremendous political boost to the government to say we have recovered these utilities which were in private hands now for the public benefit. I can assure you, however, it is not going to evolve into any significant returns either to the government and or greater and better service over and above what the Prime Minister has said. They're now going to expand electricity a bit, which is going to be a cost to the public purse, because we were told the company had no money. And the second thing is the rates are going to drop a little bit, and that will be forced by, well, not necessarily electricity, but telecoms, by competition. So I think Belizeans are still feeling, why all the energy? Why all the consultations? Why all the discussions? Why? When it really doesn't serve any serious significant purpose over and above those two which I have said, which of course the government has not said. Having read the 9th Amendment, any other comments on that line?
Well, I mean, it's obvious that it is a political intention that has been expressed. I mean, when you lay the bill in Parliament, I mean, that's your political intention. And the fact that it is, you know, an amendment that involves the 90-day delay between first and second reading means that there was obviously going to be some kind of dialogue to take place during the 90-day period. So that I wouldn't have any idea as to what those inner workings are. You provided some other details of a much more specialized nature. So that me from the outside looking in, just dealing with the amendment on the surface of it, recognize it as a political intention to make public utilities, or the three that are specified, now come under a particular umbrella of constitutional protection. You say it's moving from 16 to 21, and therefore that makes it a little more difficult in the sense that, you know, if after the next parliament you don't have a government that has a 2/3 majority in the parliament, well, you know, it will be around for a little while to come unless there is a cross-party consensus to be able to alter it. So that, to my mind, it's a political intention that obviously has some measure of popular appeal for what is being done, and therefore that is the way in which it is being expressed. And these things happen in the affairs of the state. The question is, how does the public guarantee that it is able to get the best possible deal from the political outcome? And what I'm suggesting are ways in which matters like these have been handled in other jurisdictions, and it might be something to consider outside of the political intention and the expression of a desire for national control or state control of public utilities, which has a very nice populist ring to it, but which has major implications for the public purse. And I haven't sensed that there has been that kind of discussion. I've been trying to follow this on the internet. That has not been a discussion, and I don't know the extent to which, you know, that is really an issue. But I am looking at this in a futuristic context, not in terms of the present day situation. So from the outside looking in, I think that these are things in terms of public education that need to be considered, and I'm just merely mentioning them for further consideration.
Over here, Mr. Koiva.
I do welcome the debate to be non-constitutional in terms of the management of resources by the state. But like my colleague said, and I fully agree with him, the issue of the 9th Amendment never did arise out of the principle of economic organization. It certainly wasn't that. And I'm saying this because let us look at Belize in the context of the Caribbean. Much of the countries of the Caribbean are still in the process of public sector reform. Much of them are still from the colonial system of very input, highly centralized, process-driven management. Now, if you look at the state, in the Belize case, and you were to put it on an accrual basis of accounting, the assets that the state is managing now is far more, 3-4 times what these three utilities are. And if you look at the performance of the state in the management of those assets, it has been very poor. Unfortunately, when the state is mismanaging resources, it's at the expense of the taxpayers. When the private sector is mismanaging, the marketplace will penalize the private sector. There are two things that I think is important for us to understand. The private sector is driven by profit, which is a very good thing. The public sector is driven by the welfare of the people. So inherently, there are some differences in the nature of the two. Not to suggest that the principles, the business principles that should guide them should be the same. In any civilized, democratic, progressive society today, the only way countries will be able to develop is through the maximization of the use of resources. That's entrepreneurship in the basic economic sense. I believe that the race between Adam Smith and Karl Marx is almost over if it isn't not over. We come to realize that centralized planned economies and state-run economies have failed. They have failed throughout the Caribbean, even in Trinidad, for a matter of fact. I was there. In fact, I was a part of the public sector reform for the region. So what is happening to us today is that some of us continue to hold this belief that the state can better manage resources than the private sector. I am convinced that it is not so. But there are certain things that must remain within the domain of the state. Let us look at the regulatory functions of the state. The state could not even properly manage or regulate the utilities. How are you going to manage it? You couldn't even properly regulate it. So if you look at the state today, in Belize and in other Caribbean countries, they have not moved beyond the input-oriented approach to management. They were supposed to have gone result-oriented long ago. They're supposed to have gone towards performance management long ago. The reason why the debate in this country has not taken place from the standpoint of a principle of economic organization is simply because that was never the intention. So the debate on the 9th Amendment had to do about what the people will see as the government wanted to exercise authority beyond what the people were prepared to give to it. The whole idea of the expropriation of the state had nothing to do with economic principle. It was not. It was after the state lost its case at the appellate court. And what is good to note, at the Supreme Court, at the trial judge level, the state won its case on the 9 points. But when it was appealed at the appellate court, the state lost its case on the 9 points. It brings to mind how competent the state is and to what extent it would be interfering in the judiciary. So I think what the debate should be about indeed is, yes, we should be debating the state in its management of assets, not just these three utilities. And everything you said just now I fully agree with, except that I would not be restricting them to the three utilities. The truth about it, the state is managing far more than that, and it is mismanaging it. The present and the past. And until when you can transform the mindset of the political directorate or the people as a whole, to let them go into office and to adopt the principles of management that the private sector is forced to do, because the marketplace will discipline them. Until then, the state will never be able to manage. So the argument will continue as to whether, and I think it's too theoretical. And I don't have a problem in looking at it from a theoretical standpoint, which I think you are doing, and I welcome it. But the idea of reform of the state throughout the Caribbean, including your country, Trinidad, it was more rhetoric, was outpacing the reality of the reform. It was another talk of reform, but they were never did carry out. I sat there for almost 4 years in the Caribbean as one of the three who was responsible for the reform of the state. I was responsible for the social partnership element of it. You had the legal framework element, and you had the human resource. The three elements, the CARICAD was involved with us. The European Union was involved with us, Italy in particular. And up to today, much of what we have been doing over the last 10 years, charting the way forward, remains there on the shelf and is not being implemented. I will give some credit to Trinidad, where we had the last meeting when I was in government, and at least I saw some changes. And they were doing pretty well in managing some of those enterprises, which before would have been felt to be better in the private sector. So I did see some improvement there. So I saw in Barbados. Barbados was excellent in the social partnership. They were the only one that implemented the protocols of the social partnership, where the state would work along with the business community and with the trade unions. That was social partnership. So I would believe if one look at the behavior of a private sector enterprise, which has failed, and the government bails it out and it fails again, why should it continue? So why should the people of this country want to put their taxpayers' money to buy out 3 utilities into the hands of the state when it cannot even manage what it has? So if the debate is to be taken into the realm of the non-constitutional aspect, the state will never be able to win it. But the issue facing us, Doctor, is the question of whether that constitution, as it were, that amendment, when it is even removing the alteration of the provisions of the Constitution from the section, which is in effect saying that if you alter the provisions of the Constitution, it can be inconsistent with the Constitution and it's okay. That's what Section 2 is saying. That is exactly what it is saying. That to me is certainly going down the wrong road. How can you take now the alteration of our provisions of the Constitution and say no, it can be inconsistent with the Constitution and it's okay? Except the provisional laws that flow from the Constitution, those must not be inconsistent. The issue also, they are holding on to a 3/4, to this 3/4 of the Parliament. And certainly what the people are saying, there was an amendment made to the law, not to the Constitution, because the previous government could not have amended the Constitution and they didn't have the 3/4. And the opposition was not prepared to support it. So what the previous government did to express their clear intention that the amendment of the Constitution by the Parliament was only the beginning. They must go to the people in a referendum and let the people decide whether they will support it or not. So they amended the provisional law, the regular laws, and they put it into the referendum. But if any of those sections are to be altered by the Parliament, you must go to a referendum. The incoming government removed it. So I think it was clear that the people wanted that if you're going to tamper with their Constitution, we don't want just 3/4 of the Parliament to be doing it. An argument that is being made strongly in other quarters against this so-called nationalization is that it has no place in the Constitution. It's an economic policy. If another government comes to office and wants to change that economic policy, why it shouldn't be free to be able to say we don't want to have state control over those utilities? There are so many other essential services in this country. Oil for a matter. B&E, why don't they nationalize that too if it's a matter that they will be able to manage it better? There are so many things that they could take and manage if they believe that they are better managers of the people's, well not the people, better managers of resources. So I don't buy this argument that I accept that the state, even though driven by the welfare of the people, must become efficient. But I understand the drawbacks for it to be efficient. So therefore, it's better for us to continue the road of leaving these things in the private sector. That was my view.
I'm certainly grateful to you for the enlightenment on the local situation, but I think that a lot of what you said related back to the issues of public management and so on, which I think are important issues, but I haven't seen them raised and aired and discussed, particularly in that manner, in the context of the current debate. And the Section 2 issue in the context of the newly worded Section 2. I think that with the proposed deletion of that part of Section 69 that was ousted in the jurisdiction of the courts, still leaves the courts in the picture to be able to determine the meaning of the words of the Constitution, and particularly the meaning of the words inconsistent, so that it can still be the subject of litigation, and it can still be the subject of a court inquiry to say what is or is not inconsistent with the Constitution. And I think that the big concern really was that the courts would have been ousted from being able to play that role, and it appears now that they will not be ousted. So that an amendment to the Constitution, so in other words, if the text of the Constitution is amended properly, the bill that amends it has the same protection as the Constitution itself. The question is whether the courts can or cannot declare what is inconsistent. And now that Section 69 is proposed to have that second part of it, the subsection 9, taken off from it, that was also in the jurisdiction of the courts, I suspect that it is a little more palatable than it was before when it was first proposed. But I gathered from the public lecture last night that Section 2 is still an issue that is out there for some kind of public discourse, and I rather suspect that may go on right up to the time when the bill comes back up in the Parliament. What I think has not formed part of the public debate, and certainly from a public education standpoint, are the issues that you raised that I was also alluding to, which are the public management issues. And I think that, what I was talking about in terms of Trinidad and Tobago was that the committees being able to scrutinize all the areas where the government has a controlling interest, which is what you were suggesting. But in the context of the specific amendment, I was referring to the question of having to find some mechanism to make sure that the public interest is secured in scrutinizing how these things are managed. But from the wider point of view of the fact that the state controls other resources, it is perfectly consistent to be able to maybe address that wider issue of the way in which there will be public scrutiny of public enterprises, because this is really something that also requires a change in the political culture. The political culture of a country must change in the direction that it is willing to go into that zone of demanding proper public scrutiny of public institutions, as opposed to adopting a laid-back approach and not bothering to go there, or not even bothering to take on certain issues, which are vitally important. And I rather suspect that the social impact of the 9th Amendment is that it has raised a level of consciousness in Belize about constitutional matters, and that could be where the driver for the change of political culture could come from.
Dr. Ghany, again, I'd like some clarification on sections 145 that speaks on the validity of acquisition orders in respect of the Belize Electricity Limited and Belize Telemedia Limited. And I'll just paraphrase for the audience here that it begins with a very famous phrase: for the removal of doubts. It is hereby declared that the acquisition of certain property by the government of Belize under the terms of the Electricity Act, as amended, hereinafter referred to as the Electricity Acquisition Order, and the Belize Telecommunications Act, as amended by the Belize Telecommunications Assumption of Control, referred to as the Telemedia Acquisition Order, was duly carried out for a public purpose in accordance with the laws authorizing the acquisition of such property. And no court shall inquire into the constitutionality, legality, and validity of the said acquisitions. I won't read further, just to ask though, basically, what is your interpretation of that in terms of the pending, or the I guess, yes, pending court decision that is still within the courts, or the cases that are still within the court, and also the decisions that were made prior to that. What is your take on Parliament's authority to basically etch this now in the Constitution that this is it and nothing else?
Right, well, the rest of the sentence that you were reading, beyond the acquisition of such property, etc., my information is that this is being deleted now. The part that says no court shall inquire into the constitutionality, legality, or validity of the said acquisitions, notwithstanding anything to the contrary contained in Section 17, Section 20, or any other provision of this Constitution, or any other law or rule of practice. That is now going to be deleted. So the sentence will end at the word property in the third line. So that what it is doing is a validation of something that happened in the past. So it's referring to something earlier, which by using the Constitution, therefore, the amendment is, to my mind, designed to give constitutional protection to something that has already occurred. Taking out the issue of no court shall inquire means that there is still room for judicial review, and therefore this is a constitutional amendment that deals with certain things that happened already in the past, full stop. The rest of it that went on to say, no court shall inquire, etc., notwithstanding anything to be contained in Section 17, Section 20, or any other provision. Section 17 had certain specific rights enshrined there. Section 20 likewise. That is now no longer being challenged. And then the subsection 2 of 145 is also, from what I understand, going to go. It says the bar of the jurisdiction of the court contained in subsection 1 above is absolute, and no court shall assume jurisdiction on any ground whatsoever, including without limitation any alleged ground of lack of jurisdiction in the persons making the said acquisition orders, or any ground alleging breach of the rules of natural justice. All of that, I understand, is going to go. So that fundamentally alters the character of the amendment, so that what was subsection 3 is now going to become subsection 2, and what was subsection 4 is now going to become subsection 3. So that is now going to fundamentally change the thing. But as it was worded, well, as it is worded, but as it is proposed to be changed, it certainly reduces the level of angst over the situation, so that the courts still remain part of the process, because in 145 there are only references to 2 entities. In 143 there are references to 3 entities. And obviously there is a domestic political reason why that is so, and I just take note of the fact that 143 talks about Belize Electricity Limited, Belize Telemedia, and Belize Water Services, and then the D is gone, any other entity designated as a public utility. So 143 now is just dealing with 3 entities, and 145 is dealing with 2 entities. So that obviously 145 is dealing with something that has happened already, seems to be referring to something that has happened already, as opposed to 145 is talking about something that has happened already. 143 seems to be talking about a different set of entities, and I'm not sure of the domestic political reason for that.
I understand your interpretation, Dr. Ghany, but can you tell me what is your take on the fact that, well, not the fact, but the proposal here is that what was done in the past now is deemed by the government, or will be deemed by the government, as being for a public purpose. How unusual is this, looking at the legal interpretation here? How usual or unusual or consistent with any legal provisions that you've seen or that you've combed constitutionally, or even within any law, does it authorize this type of writing here to say that you can make something, what was done in the past, constitutional?
Well, it's a validation. It's really a validation of something that's happened, because it's using the past tense. Was duly carried out for a public purpose. So it's a validation of something that has happened already. I mean, in Grenada in 1985, there was a Validation Act, number 1 of 1985, that validated everything that went on in the interregnum between the overthrow of Eric Ghary and the resumption of constitutional government. And speaking to the future, saying that, well, all of these things that were done there, the people's laws, the Governor General's proclamations, and all various other things that were done in that interregnum, deemed now to have been validated. And therefore it was a validation there. And I suspect that this is also the Constitution being put in the role of validating something that has happened, to say that this that has already happened was duly carried out. Now, the power of Parliament to make law is not only present and future, but is also retrospective. Parliament can legislate retrospectively, backwards in time, and that is clearly something that any Parliament can do in any part of the Commonwealth. It's part of the powers of Parliament. I think that the part that was saying that no court shall inquire was really what was creating some difficulty, because the Section 17 and Section 20 rights were being ousted in the process together with the courts. And I think that if that is now going to be deleted from the provision, then all you're left with is a validation of something that has happened and a statement that it was done for a public purpose. So the Constitution becomes the vehicle for that, and there obviously is some domestic political reason why that may be so. But just looking at it as it stands there, to me it's a validation of something that's already happened.
And there's nothing wrong with that?
Well, it has happened before in other parts. I mean, as I gave the example of Grenada, where the state, in order to, avoid all kinds of difficulties, legal, constitutional, and other, that could arise between what happened, in March of 1979, when Eric Ghary was overthrown, to when the first Parliament, after the general elections held following the resumption of constitutional government, to the time when that Parliament met on the 28th of December 1984. Act number 1 of 1985 was the first act of Parliament that the resumed civilian government of Grenada passed, which was a validation act of all the things that had gone on in the interim, because the state had to find a self-correcting way to be able to address validation of certain things. So I will see this to some extent as dealing with something that has already happened that needs to be validated. But the further clause of taking out the courts from inquiring into that would have represented a problematic area for the separation of powers. And that may to a large extent explain why perhaps it is coming out, because it was also interfering with Section 17 and Section 20 rights in the Constitution. And I rather suspect that the public outcry would have included that. And then, to go on with that subsection 2, talking about the bar and the jurisdiction of the court contained in subsection 1 above is absolute, and no court shall assume jurisdiction on any ground whatsoever, including without limitation any alleged ground of lack of jurisdiction in the persons making the said acquisition orders, on any ground alleging breach of the rules of natural justice. That is very, very far-reaching language, but it appears that that is going to go now. So it's just purely a validation of the acquisition orders.
And that validation can be challenged now in the court?
Well, I mean,
Because
I think what Section 17 and 20 permits. Section 17 and Section 20 permits certain things to be challenged. Okay. That's part of the human rights provision, the Bill of Rights.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Dr. Ghany, the removal of that section, as you rightly explained, has reinstated, if you like, or revalidated Section 17 and Section 20. But there's still a troubling matter with respect to Section 2, which talks about the new subsection to clarify what other law means. And it says, other law occurring in subsection 1 above does not include a law to alter any of the provisions of this Constitution, which is passed by the National Assembly in conformity with Section 69. While the rather brutal language, if you may, of the clause following the acquisition orders has now been removed, and therefore is saying back to the courts, okay, you now may still inquire into those acts, but you will know, of course, that the question of whether it was done for a public purpose has been stated in the Constitution, so you know that it was done for a public purpose. You cannot argue it wasn't done for a public purpose. That's the whole point of putting this there, I can tell you that. But the amendment to section 2, which says other law, is those kinds of laws, but it is not a law to amend the Constitution itself. Is still troubling. Even though the section 69 amendment subsection 9 says, and a law passed by the National Assembly to enter any of the provisions of this Constitution which is passed in conformity to this section will not be open to challenge in any court of law on any grounds whatsoever. That is a bit redundant because section 69 already says, at subsection 6, if I remember correct, already says that once the Speaker signs and assures the Governor General that in fact the law was passed in conformity with the procedure, no court may inquire into it. It is basically common sense. What it is saying is that once these 24 people or these 21 people, as the case might be, have passed this and it goes to the Senate and a simple majority passed it, there is no question that it is properly passed. That is the procedure. It's a procedure. But our problem is, or some of our problem is that this other law issue in section 2, which limits it only to the substantive laws emanating from the Constitution, but seems still to house laws which affect the Constitution itself, is still giving some rise to difficulty. Because, and I will say to you, let us say tomorrow the government decides to amend section 27, which doesn't come under section 2, and section 27 deals with citizenship rights. It says you may hold dual nationality. And let us say tomorrow there is this sudden national spirit and feeling that says, look, we can't accommodate these people with dual citizenship. They must all be one or another. That section doesn't come under section 20, under schedule 2, so it requires only 21 people, and it can be done in one day because it doesn't come under the 90-day rule either. And let us say there are about 5,000 or 10,000 Belizeans who hold dual nationality. Clearly, they would want to go to the court to challenge that. Not challenge the right of the government, the National Assembly, to make the amendment. We know they have the right, but to challenge the substance of the amendment because it would clearly violate some entrenched rights you have come to enjoy and to have and to live. Similarly, if section 112, which deals with pensions, were to be amended, even though those don't fall under section 3 to 19, which is the fundamental rights and freedoms, those are still rights enjoyed. You've been enjoying pension, you've worked all your life, and government suddenly decides for fiscal reasons we can't deal with pensions anymore, and it's going to amend that. That also doesn't enjoy the protection of Schedule 2. Clearly, somebody would want to go to court and say, no, man, no, please. You have the right to amend it, but you're affecting some rights which we have enjoyed, and would want the court to rule on those matters. And so I still, and I think many other people, have a problem with limiting the court's decisions only to the other laws, which is what section 2 is the amendment to section 2 is attempting to do. Your comments?
Yeah, well, I see the section 2 argument, and what I see it as is it's a refinement of other law into separating the bill that amends the Constitution from other bills. And that's what I'm seeing. And so it's saying that a bill that amends the Constitution becomes amended, the text of the Constitution becomes amended, which would make it the supreme law.
Yes.
The very bill that does the amendment, therefore, once passed, is not the target of litigation. I mean, the Constitution is already amended, so the bill is there, and therefore stands as an act of the Parliament to be numbered as act number so-and-so or whatever in terms of the sequence. So all I'm seeing is that the umbrella is going to bring underneath it, the Constitution stands under its own umbrella, and all of the acts that amend the Constitution can come and stand under the same umbrella, and all the other legislation stay on the outside. But I see section 2, subsection 2, as really being about section 69 and not about section 2. Because to me, what it is about is that it's saying that the words other law occurring in subsection 1 above do not include a law to alter any of the provisions of the Constitution which is passed by the National Assembly in conformity with section 69 of the Constitution. So really it's a procedural issue. And the point you made about the Speaker's certificate in subsection 6 of section 69, the Speaker's certificate is only that the Governor General, in receiving it, must have certification of the Speaker. Right. So you can't challenge the certificate of the Speaker. The certificate of the Speaker is conclusive. So the issue of the Governor General assenting to it is that the Governor General could assent to it and the Speaker's certificate is not there, then it renders the act invalid.
Yes.
So that is what I'm seeing. So what I'm seeing Section 2 now doing is saying that the Constitution and anything that amends the Constitution can stand as under the protection of the Constitution, and that there is a refinement between ordinary law and a law that amends the Constitution. That's how I'm seeing it. But the danger to me in terms of the separation of powers would have been the rest of subsection 9 of the Section 69 that would have said, and a law passed by the National Assembly to alter any of the provision of this Constitution which is passed in conformity with this section shall not be open to challenge in any court of law on any ground whatsoever. Now that that is gone, to me, that makes it more palatable, the whole Section 2 thing. All I'm seeing the Section 2 as doing is saying that the Constitution stands here, and anything that amends the Constitution can stand with it. And that's how I'm seeing it. So it's a refinement of what is other law to separate all of these acts that are passed to amend the Constitution from any other act that the National Assembly may pass. And that's the context in which I'm seeing it. So that, for me, I am not seeing that there is a major threat involved here, but I think if subsection 9 had been left in its original form, there would have been a problem.
You're you're saying that even, you know, there's been a case before where section, the 6th Amendment had its challenges because it attempted also to amend certain rights with respect to landowners. And it was challenged, that act was challenged, even though it was attempting to amend the Constitution, and the Supreme Court ruled on it. And as a result of that ruling, the government did not further its appeal, but amended the matter. I think that is what has given rise to Section 2, where the government is saying basically, how dare you? We are telling you, when we attempt to amend this Constitution, it is proper. I agree 100% it's proper with respect to the procedure, but I think the fine issue people are still having is with the aspect of content and intent. If the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal and the CCJ have the right to interpret sections 3 to 19 as it now stands, let us say we frame those out and those become sacrosanct. So any law emanating therefrom, any of those sections, the court may rule whether it is in conformity with those sections. But what if you intend to amend that section itself? You spoil, so to speak, the mold. And you're saying, okay, well, the courts are barred until that mold is really solidified again, and now the courts may rule on anything emanating therefrom again. That is the difficulty the Belizeans are having. For example, if you go tomorrow and the government says, okay, the whole question of preventive detention, for example, that has come up over and over under, I think it was Amendment 8, proposed Amendment 8. What is happening, what Belizeans fear, is that if tomorrow the government decides to amend that section, the courts may say, well, government has amended the section, we can now only rule on any law emanating from that amended section, but not on the amended section itself. That is where I think the debate over the other law comes in still. People are not quarreling whether the government has the right to amend the Constitution. I think everybody understands that by its 2/3 or 3/4 majority and its 90-day waiting period, with or without consultations. People don't have any difficulty with that. I don't think people have any difficulty with certain sections of the Constitutions being amended. But the difficulty stems right between that section 3 and 19, for which the people of Belize continue to be nervous. Unfortunately, the 9th Amendment is a swoop all of everything, and under utilities, which is very emotional, everything was kind of being swept underneath. Really, quite frankly, to my mind, they should have simply just did it for the utilities, and perhaps we would not have invited you to our beautiful country because nobody would have been arguing about it. But it's the other things that came in kind of packed in underneath that is frightening people, and particularly things that could affect Section 3 to Section 19. And the other law sort of still looms over there to say, okay, we can do this, we can't do this. What I would have liked, and what I will propose, is that if you intend to do that, then when you do make those amendments as per Section 69, strengthen Section 69 to ensure that when you make those amendments, you do have the support of the majority of the people. And there is a way to do that. I can tell you right now that the entire National Assembly, if you took the votes of the entire National Assembly, it is only 56% of the votes that was cast. And if you took the votes of the entire government side, all 25, it is only 48.2% of the total votes that was cast. So, and if you take 24 persons, it is only 46.7% of the total votes that were cast. So you couldn't say legitimately, maybe conceptually you can say, well, the party had an overwhelming victory, but if you were going to say, each man stand up and tell me who sent you here, how many people you're speaking for, they couldn't muster 50%. That's all 24, couldn't muster 50%. And therefore, all the public noise from the consultation, you can't convince me that, oh, see, everybody is saying yes. If you want it to really be serious, then go to Section 69, I think it is 1 or 2, which had said for the first couple of years before the general election, you had to be unanimous. Well, if you wanted to do Section 2 to Section 19 and amend it, stick in Section 69, something like that, to say to amend Section 69, you have to be unanimous. Then the people of Belize would be satisfied that it's not an easy thing to haul and pull. That is the problem Belizeans are having. If that thing is clear, you don't have any debate in the House or the Senate. You just be passed. Because I don't think anybody quarreling over BTL, BL, and WASA anymore. I can tell you they're not quarreling over water. That one slipped under the radar and nobody even raised a finger. BTL is already now a kind of done deal, and BL, they're getting used to it. So by the time this is passed, I think will be no problem. But Section 2 is still a problem.
Yeah, well, I think that you know, the issue of your human rights provisions. I mean, I know that the case on Trinidad and Tobago of McLeod versus the Attorney General of Trinidad and Tobago, which dealt with the question of access to the courts on whether constitutional amendments are properly passed or not. The Privy Council at that time ruled that regardless of what happens with the constitutional amendment, you always have the right of access to the courts. And I rather suspect the CCJ was hinting at that the other day in the application. So the CCJ is already asserting that the CCJ has the right to interpret the meaning of the words of the Constitution because nobody else in the Constitution can do so. So they were going to assert, or they're signaling that they will assert that right anyhow. And they would derive that from Section 6 of the Constitution, where all persons are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to the equal protection of the law. So it's the equal protection clause that guarantees that. Now, Section 6 was not being interfered with.
Right.
What you're raising is if a government goes to amend Section 6, what happens at a future time. The other thing is with the proposed amendment, you know, how would the other side handle this if they were to come into power? Would there still be the same level of fear, or would the fear move from one side to the other side? Would you know, if there are fears now in one quarter of the society, if the other side came into power, would the side that goes out of power now become fearful of what the side that's in power would have? And if that's going to be the case, then there is a fundamental trust issue with regard to the exercise of power, and therefore the political culture of the society then has to start getting more engaged in public scrutiny and public engagement on these issues, because I think that it's healthy that this kind of debate can take place and people can be concerned about their constitutional rights and what's happening with their constitution and so on. And the fact that, you know, a certain majority is required because, you know, that majority is there because the electorate voted in a particular way, and those who chose not to vote, well, you know, you missed your chance. And I think that, you know, if there's one thing that I'm sensing is coming from all of this, is that there is an enhanced level of political awareness and political consciousness, which to my mind has the potential to bring about an alteration of the political culture of the country in a direction that is now going to start questioning the state on its performance management and how you're handling the resources and taxpayer dollars. So when budget time comes and so on, you want to hear the philosophy espoused in the budget and how the government is going to deal with certain things and so on. So you get that. But I mean, political mobilization, I mean, I've heard about these consultations and people being brought in and jerseys and supporters and everything else. And I've heard all the stories. That tells me that you have an active political process, which is healthy for democracy, because it's not happening on one side, it's happening on all sides. So that means that the democracy is healthy, but there are other areas that need to be mobilized. And I think the rising level of political consciousness is what I see coming out of the whole 9th Amendment debate. that there is now a greater appreciation of things constitutional. But what I think has not yet come out is the question of how does the state manage its resources, which is what I think I started off by talking about this, and then from the audience we had the discussion of, well, it's not just these three, the state manages so much more, and therefore you need a kind of greater sensitivity about how taxpayer dollars are being managed. And I think that will be a political culture change in terms of the wider process. Thank you.
Any more questions? I think this will be the final question.
I don't mean to dominate the mic, but I have one other burning question. Just to carry on your statement on proper management of taxpayers' dollars, the Social Security Fund comes to mind, and I'd like to guide the discussion to a paragraph there on page 5, and I'll read the paragraph or paraphrase elements of it for the audience appreciation. It says, provided that in the event the Social Security Board intends to sell the whole or part of its shareholding, which would result in the government shareholding falling before 51% of the issued stock capital of a public utility provider, the board shall first offer for sale to the government, and the government shall purchase from the board so much of the shareholding as would be necessary to maintain the government's ownership and control of a public utility provider, and every such sale to the government shall be valid and effectual for all purposes. Dr. Ghany, I'd like you to please give us your interpretation of that, and also maybe tell us more on what are the implications here, and what would be your recommendation to, if need be, to have, I know you mentioned an exit clause, or somewhere we can have some type of scrutiny over public funds. What would be your recommendation in this aspect?
Well, it's not so much a recommendation, but I've wondered about this, what happens between 50.1% and 50.9%. And that is because 51 is the magic number. And that is something that I've wondered about, but there is this obligation to offer it to the government. So what happens if the government decides that it will sell 50.5% of the shareholding. I mean, I don't know if this would take us into another area of some consideration of the membership of the board at the once you're getting below 51%, as opposed to 50%, so that there is that window in between 50.1 and 50.9%. That is something that would have to be looked at, and it talks about here, the board shall first offer for sale to the government, and the government shall purchase from the board so much of the shareholding as will be necessary to maintain the government's ownership and control of a public utility provider, and every such sale to the government shall be valid and effectual for all purposes. Well, in terms of the definition, by taking out that 143D, which says that any other entity designated as a public utility provider for the purposes of this part by a resolution passed by the National Assembly in that behalf, means that you're not speaking to the future about any other providers. You're only dealing with the three that are listed here. So that, to my mind, this particular clause is confining itself to the three that are listed here, and is not referring to the broader network that could have been possible if 143D was going to be maintained. So I rather suspect that in the context of these three entities, this is what is going to operate in respect of the future. The question is, whether or not there are ways for the government to be able to negotiate around this, and falling below 51% leaves a window. A future government who may not want to stick with the 51% would have to wiggle somewhere between a 50.1 and a 50.9 if it is that you want to be able to get out of the deal. In other words, if it is that you want to change the way in which the company is going to be run, and you want to invite the private sector in. It might be one of the ways in which this could be done, because the 51% is a magic number and not a percentage thereof, or 50%, or a sub percentile. So that I've looked at that, and that has intrigued me somewhat. But I must say that by taking out 143D does not put any other entity under the chopping block, and that therefore this really applies to the three. And 50.1 to 50.9 seems to be the only wiggle room that's available, if you're talking about an exit clause. But other than that, 51% is the magic number.
Unless anybody has a burning question for Dr. Ghany, we're going to close the Q&A session. Yeah. I'd like to remind you that the discussion, of course, is not over here. The Chamber has collaborated as well with the Bar Association to procure the opinion of a legal expert. And I think that opinion is available already, or should be available within the next week. So we would like to thank members who have contributed to the fund, because it was not cheap. And together with the Bar Association, within the next week, we should be getting that opinion. So thank you very much to members who have contributed. We would like to remind you that if you want to contribute, you still can. We accept any amount of contribution. I mean, this is a big burning issue. I think all the citizens should be at least tuned in to the discussion, if not want to influence how it moves forward. So thank you very much. And with that, I introduce Alberto, who's going to give us the thank you. Vote of thanks.
All right. Good evening once again. Well, I'll first start with thanking Dr. Ghany for being here with us. I think this issue has been a very highly politicized issue, and really has, now that I reflect, it has really clouded our ability to look further than today. And you've provided some areas that we really need to advocate for, and that is the outlook and the benefits arising from the nationalization of the utilities, costs and performance being among the benefits, and the economic development specifically for the private sector, because we are affected by these utilities in business. And of course, looking forward at the industry dynamics and the role that these utilities will play in allowing the industries to grow and mature. So thanks for providing that. I think the big thing here is oversight and the social responsibility, and that's something that I think the Chamber needs to continue to advocate for now. We've definitely been at the forefront, and I think has resulted in considerations, because those have not been accepted as yet, of striking out some of the areas in the 9th Amendment, or proposed 9th Amendment. So thank you very much for being here with us. I think this was very healthy. I think an applause for the process. I'd like to thank Reverend Smiling for leading us in prayer. Thank Mrs. Jane Bennett and the University of the West Indies. I think we're making the MOU a reality, and we'll continue to do so. So thank you very much. And thanks to all the members who came out. It's Friday, and I know we'd love to be home, but this is something we need to be dedicated to. And thanks to all of you who participated in the process and engaged in the discussions. And good evening to you. Thank you.